Ben Yagoda, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversations.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
This is a bit unusual in that you haven't actually written a book about baseball, directed a film about baseball, written music about baseball, but you are a baseball fan and you are a former professor of literature. So in that regard, I was interested. I found a review you did on Kevin Baker's wonderful book of the New York Game. And what struck me in it was you like the book generally, but do you remember what your main criticism of it
There
was?
was something, I'm trying to remember, there was something he did a lot, and I think
Uh,
I pointed that out, but I don't remember what it was.
his use of italics.
Oh, that's right. Okay, yes. Yeah, he overcooked the italic. So I've gotten to be, what I really was a professor of, I was officially a professor of English, but really all I taught was journalism, which was what I had done and what I still do, and write books in journalism. And over years of doing that, I got I don't know, nerdy or really into it. So correcting thousands of student papers, you start noticing things. So the italics that Kevin Baker, but I thought his writing was wonderful. He didn't need the italics. That's kind of, like grabbing somebody's lapels and shouting in their face, and he didn't have to do that.
So when you read a book for pleasure, not for review,
Mm.
are you bothered by some of these little ticks,
Ooh.
or can you overlook them for the greater picture?
I would like to think I can overlook them. I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, uh, you know, there are writers that I really like Kate Atkinson, a novelist in the present day, Charles Dickens, a novelist of the past, and a lot of these people have um, idiosyncrasies and things they tend to do a lot. But if it's a writer I really like, that becomes part of the charm. And so, yeah, I think I can overlook it. And by the way, I do want to say that I'm a baseball fan. I've written, probably a couple of dozen reviews of baseball books over the years, including Ron Bloomberg's book about his relationship with Thurman Munson and Dan Okren's book Nine Innings and lots of them. Um, and I would have wanted to write a book about baseball. The problem is, as you know better than anybody else, there have been so many books about baseball that it's hard to find a fresh topic. But the one that I came closest to, and I kind of feel I should have done, was this guy.
Which is
Christy Mathewson.
ah,
Um, I had read G.H. Fleming's great book, The Unforgettable Season, I think was the title, about the 1908 season, and was fascinated with the character Christy Mathewson. This was, 25 plus years ago. If it had been today, with the access to databases and newspapers of the time, I might have done it. But at the time, it seemed like I would just have to be stuck reading microfilm and dusty archives for years on end, and I didn't pursue it. But that was the closest that I came to it.
it's interesting you mentioned Mathewson because just the other day I got a new book about Mathewson, Baseball's First Superstar: The Lost Life Story of Christy Mathewson by Alan D. Gaff, my University of Nebraska Press, just
No.
arrived. But I'm curious. The you talk about if you were writing it now, it would be different because of the methods of research.
Yeah.
How important is that in? Because I mean, I'm looking at there's always a new biography about Babe Ruth. There's always a new biography about Jackie Robinson. And I'm wondering how much more is there out there, even
Right.
because of digitization and accessibility, that was not there before? And does it really make that much of a difference?
Well, I would think in a case like Babe Ruth or Jackie Robinson, no, just because the previous writers have mined the microfilm and the archives. for somebody less that had been written about less well known, um, yeah, there is stuff out there. I mean, newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com, the Library of Congress project on digitizing America. Um, if something was covered in the newspapers in that period of late 19th century into early 20th century, I would think that right now, much more is available than would have been to a researcher 25, 30 years ago.
I'm just thinking there was a book not all that long ago, a new biography about Pete Rose, and that went into great depth about his gambling issues and his questionable personality that had not been covered to that degree
Yeah.
in previous biographies.
That would have been, I would think, a case of, interviewing and traditional reporting, because the people that he dealt with, many of them are still around. So if some intrepid reporter can get to one of those people who hadn't talked before, that could produce new revelations. It wouldn't have been things that would have been covered in the newspapers. It would have to go beyond that.
When you were growing up, you grew up a Yankee fan, and you changed allegiance when you moved to Philadelphia.
Correct.
Why?
Why did I change allegiance?
I mean, there are people who are a fan of a team no matter where they end up.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good question. You'd have to ask my psychotherapist or a good psychologist. I don't know. But I think you're right. There are some people who are loyal to their bones and others not. Um, and what's the difference between those people? I don't know. Um, it's funny. Well, first of all, talking about my language nerddom, I like it that you said Yankee fan, not Yankees fan.
Uh-huh.
'Cause that's a thing that has changed. I've written about that and it actually might relate to my book on Britishisms, Gobsmacked, because um, the British tend to put an S on words like that. They'll talk about a drinks menu or jobs report. Americans traditionally did not. It was a job report and a drink menu. We've kind of adopted some of those British things and team names for some reason. I don't think it has to do with Britishism. And I did a sort of search on it. It's the kind of thing I do. And, talking about research methods, with Google Books and NewYorkTimes.com, you can research all sorts of language things. In fact, the internet, the best thing it's for is researching use of language,
Hmm.
because it doesn't matter whether what the person wrote is true or not, because there's a lot of stuff on the internet, obviously, that's not true. But if they said Yankee versus Yankees, um, that's significant. Or if they use the word gobsmacked or other Britishisms, that's right there. So anyway, it was around the late 70s, early 80s when the custom changed. For instead of Yankee fan, it was Yankees fan. Instead of Cub fan, it was Cubs fan. And now only people of a certain age,
Hmm.
like you and me, will say Yankee fan. But it gave pleasure to my ears when I heard you say that.
Well, when you were growing up, I'm guessing you read the sports pages. Did you have a favorite writer?
When I was obviously definitely read the sports pages, started following the Yankees when I was 7 in 1961, when that was their incredible season. It was the Maris
Mhm.
Mantle home run duel, and my father brought me to a game where the Yankees played the Washington Senators, and I think hit about 5 or 6 home runs. Bill Skowron and Elston Howard, and I was kind of hooked. In terms of writing, at the age of 7, 8, 9, 10, I was not that uh, dis discriminating. My father would point out some of the writers in the New York Times, which is the paper we got,
Mhm.
um, Arthur Daly and John Drebinger and some of those old school people. Then he started bringing home the New York Post, which had some of those, they called them the chipmunks,
Right.
those
I was
those
just
kind
going
of
to say
new journalists, Maury Allen and
Roy
Phil
Allen.
Pepe and Leonard. Oh, I guess the Times had Leonard Coppett. The Post had Leonard Schechter, or maybe it was vice versa. So
No,
I
you're right.
started, right. So I
Yeah.
started getting into some of those writers, and then then when Robert Lipsyte came to the Times, I loved his writing, and I was able to interview him for a story at New Jersey Monthly years later. And then Red Smith,
Mm,
and then Roger Angell in the New Yorker was,
yeah.
uh, and I was able to interview him too, for my book that was the history of the New Yorker called About Town, and he actually started his coverage, you might know this, of baseball in the New Yorker in 1962. The sort of point of departure being the arrival of the New York Mets. And so he proposed to the editor of the New Yorker, William Shawn, that he go down to spring training and write a story about the Mets. And William Shawn's response was, "What's spring training?" He was not a big sports fan, but he gave the okay. And Roger, for the next, gosh, 50 plus years,
Mhm.
just wrote the most amazing stuff about baseball.
When you were teaching your journalism classes, was there any discussion of sports journalism in there, or was just journalism in general?
I had colleagues. We had a course at Delaware in sports writing, and I had colleagues that taught that. I never did. I would might have enjoyed it, but they had more of an expertise. I do remember that when I first got to Delaware in 1992, the sports editor of the school paper was this kid who was very talented, and he wrote a piece that was in the paper and excuse me, was so good that I Xeroxed it and taught it to my classes.
Mhm.
Um, the kid's name was Jeff Pearlman.
Mm,
You know the name. So he
right.
became, a noted author, Sports Illustrated,
That's
the
funny.
John Rocker incident,
Right.
and on and on. So we had a number of talented sports writers and journalists that came through the the school over the years.
When you are reading a baseball book, at what point, I mean, I am not, for all the reading I've done, I don't consider myself an expert on the game, but I can recognize errors in either fact or style. Uh, does it ever get to a point where it bothers you so much that you just can't continue?
There was one book, I do a lot. I've reviewed books since in 1977 or something like that, and it's something I enjoy doing. Um, Continue doing it. I just had a book review in the Washington Post about not a book about baseball, a book about uh, visions of the end of the world in the apocalypse from the Bible onto the present. Um, and I kind of, Ann Tyler, the great novelist, had a policy where she would only write the review if she liked the book. If she started reading and didn't like it, wouldn't do it. And I tend to pick books, if some editor suggests it, or if I pitch it to an editor that I think I'm going to like and going to be interesting, it will be interesting. I only recall one time when I really felt like you were saying this book is so poorly done that I don't even know what to say. And I ended up writing the review, and I think the point I tried to make, I did. It was a first time author, and I didn't want to, um, you know, devastate that person or have them feel, terribly. Um, so I sort of framed it as a book about the publishing, a review about the publishing industry. That the editors of this book did not serve it well. There were factual errors. There was problems with style. There was problems in emphasis and tone and all sorts of things. And the editors, were responsible for having the book come out, and it was their duty to kind of address some of these things. So that that sort of gave me a path to write the book. That's the only one that I can really remember feeling that way. You know, virtually always either really like the book, like Kevin Baker's book, or find the topic really interesting, like this one about the apocalypse. And that was very well written too by a guy named Dorian Linsky. Or if there are flaws in the book, there's something interesting to say about that. I ultimately find. So yeah, it was just that one time when I really had to wrestle with whether to do it or not.
You bring up an interesting point about the role of the editor in a book. Now, you've written several books. I'm guessing that there were different editors involved in
Yeah,
most of these books. When you are writing a book, are these books that you have pitched or books that you have been pitched to write?
yeah,
And if the latter, if you've been asked the role of the editor, how important is it to you to have an editor? This is a silly question. Who knows the topic? Who knows what he's talking
yeah,
about?
yeah,
Because I'll just say
yeah.
quickly, uh, I find that in a lot of the baseball books, you might not have an editor who
Hmm.
knows the topic that well, and that's why
Hmm.
some of these mistakes get in.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think it would be important. I mean, William Shaw didn't know what spring training was, but he was a genius editor. So he was able to overcome that, and I'm sure Roger Angel's copy didn't need much of anything. Yeah, of the books I've written, I mean, I've written about kind of 10 or so books that are, just me and um me writing, an entire book. I've written three books that are kind of books for hire, either co-written or a history of an arboretum here near where I live in Swarthmore. And I've edited two books. The collected stories of O. Henry for the Library of America, and an anthology called The Art of Fact about literary journalism. Um, but of those 10 books that I wrote on my own, all but one were my idea.
Mhm.
Um, and it seems like that's important because the 10th is the one, I won't mention what it is the one that I'm least proud of, than the others. And yeah, sometimes editors have been very helpful. I mean, but this book, Gobsmacked: The British Invasion of American English, my latest book, from Princeton University Press. Uh, I had written the whole manuscript, submitted it there, and they accepted it. And this really, really smart editor, Anne Severies, worked on the book, and she immediately said, "Let's call it Gobsmacked!" Exclamation point. And it was brilliant. It was perfect title. And then my very first book was a biography of Will Rogers. Um, and because I'd never written a book before, I did a chunk of it sort of in the middle, um, and just sent it into the editor, say, tell me what you think. How am I doing? And basically say, yeah, it's good, but two things. And again, they were brilliant comments. Number one, he said, just because you found out what Will Rogers had for breakfast on July 27th, 1926, that doesn't mean it's interesting to a reader. And it was so true because as a researcher,
Mhm.
you find out this thing, you say, wow, here's what he had for breakfast. He wrote it in his diary. Who cares? I mean, unless it's part of a bigger point. And the other thing he said is something that I still kind of grapple with. He said, use too many quotations.
Mhm.
Um, And I love quotations. Um, it gives you the flavor of what the person said or wrote. But again, you have to think about the reader. And will they want to read this really long thing, not in your voice? You've kind of relinquished your storytelling while you're putting out this quote there. And so, and just today I'm working on my next book, and I'm dealing with how much quotation I should do. So, um, often or sometimes certainly an editor will say something that is sometimes I'm going to start again. Let me just take a little cough drop.
You know, this is something that Ben and I have been discussing, our mutual ailments here.
Sorry about that. Sometimes an editor will say something that just kind of sticks in your brain for, you know, 35 years. And that's an example of that.
Will Rogers was your first book. How did you come to the idea that you wanted to do that?
Um, Wanted to write a book. I'd been a magazine writer, had written a lot of profiles. So profiles, biography seemed the way to go. um, Also, when you write a book, for me, and I think for a lot of writers, structure is a challenge, an issue, and a biography has that built-in chronological structure of the person's life. So, then it was just finding the right person that hadn't been like Babe Ruth written about, incessantly, was interesting enough to me to want to spend a couple of years, was it would be interesting enough to a publisher or the public. Will Rogers was the first one that I hit that checked all the boxes. And for various reasons, there had been some books, but there hadn't really been a real true biography for many years. And he was a fascinating character. He, when he died suddenly in a plane crash in 1935, he was arguably the most popular person in the country, or maybe second to Roosevelt. And over the years, for various reasons, he had been kind of forgotten. So it was a great. It ended up being a great subject and um, a great experience for my first book.
There have been a few books over the years that I still recall very fondly, and that they've made a lasting impression on me. And one of them was your book, Memoir, a Biography,
Mm.
because I find the whole idea of memory fascinating. How two people can be experiencing the same thing, yet this one's memory is totally different than that one's memory. When you were writing that book, how much of it from your own memory, your own experience was involved in that?
If I understand your question correctly, nothing. I mean, it was uh, there
Just
wasn't
other
any.
people's memories?
Well, I did, and what you say is absolutely right about the intricacies and fallibility of memory. And one of the, I really enjoy doing research and finding out as much as I can about stuff, and one thing leads me to another thing. And in that book, one of the things that was interesting was looking into the psychology of memory, and especially what they call autobiographical memory and the fallibility of that. The sort of common sense model is memory is kind of a recorder, and some of it is available and some of it's not, like a tape recorder. But it apparently doesn't work that way. That memory is constructed from the get-go, so it's kind of almost like a memory of a memory, and that leads to uh, what you're saying about different people having different experiences or different memories of the same thing. So that was a really interesting aspect of that book. And by the way, speaking of titles, you just improved on the title of that book. So, or the
What
subtitle.
was that not the title?
Well, it was the title, but what you said was the subtitle I wanted, which was Memory, a Biography, which
Oh,
would have been great. The
uh,
actually I lost that battle, and the subtitle was Memory, a History, which
mhm.
isn't as good.
Well, I thought it was wonderful. Uh, Looking back on that Will Rogers book, if you with the intervening years of experience and practice, would you have changed anything about that, do you think?
You know, I have occasion to to look at it now and then for whatever reason, and most recently, very poignantly, if not tragically, uh, I had occasion to look at it because Will Rogers' home,
Right.
what he called his ranch in Palisades, California, that he lived in
Mhm.
the last 7 years of his life, was destroyed in the fire. So I was going back on the description of that really wonderful, wonderful place. Um, I think the one thing that I was talking about this with somebody that I would have wanted to explore a little bit more, or maybe a good deal more, is his Indian or Native American heritage. He was about one quarter Cherokee on both his mother's and father's side. Was born in later Oklahoma, then Indian Territory, and he, was proud of that. Spoke about it throughout his life, um, including saying, "My people didn't come over on the Mayflower; they met the boat." Uh, but the sort of nuances of that and the different um, sort of strata within the Cherokee community is an interesting, complicated subject, and I don't think I was. um, I could have explored it a bit more, and that would be the thing that I would want it to do if I did the book again.
Do you have a favorite baseball book?
Yes, and I think probably if you ask, big readers of baseball books, a good number would say this book. Um, the second is The Unforgettable Season by G.F. Fleming that we mentioned, but first would be The Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter,
Mhm.
which, as you know, he got these ball players who had played in the 1900s, 1910s, when he started. I don't know when he started doing the interviews, 50s, 60s,
Mhm.
and just had these wonderful, wonderful interviews mixed in with uh, pictures, photographs. I still remember the one that, how do you say the man's name? Lajoie?
La Joie.
Lajoie, Napoleon Lajoie had endorsed, you know, Red Devil chewing tobacco or something, and it said, Lajoie choose, not Red Devil, whatever the name is, ask him if he don't. Which, being a, my language guy sense, just stood up and paid notice on that. But that would be my favorite. And
Yeah.
so top three would be that, the Fleming book, and Roger Angel, aforementioned Roger Angel, The Summer Game.
Mhm.
Those would be the top three.
Having said La Joie, now I realize that that's my French Canadian background coming through because I've also heard La Jouet. So,
Okay.
but I'm not going to say which is absolutely correct. Uh, I'm trying to think. Uh, Great. Yes. Have you heard the audio version of Glory of the Times?
No, I wasn't aware that.
Fascinating. It is
So it's
fascinating.
the actual tapes?
It's the actual tapes, and to hear these who were once young men now in their elder years is fascinating. And if you
Yeah,
have a chance, I highly recommend that. It
absolutely.
reminds me there are several books of photography uh, from those days. I'm thinking of one from George Conlon had a collection of photographs, and even young men. I mean, these players are basically in their 20s and 30s, but there's something about them, maybe their hard upbringing, that they just looked old to begin with.
Right, right.
Yeah, the black and white of those days. Well, Ben Yagoda, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, baseball and journalism, and I have read Gobsmacked, an excellent, because I've been watching Ted Lasso,
Oh
uh,
yeah,
and I have to watch it with the closed captions because I've missed so much because it's very quick, very witty, and there's a lot of British in there that it doesn't sit on my ears as it would a native.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Well, Ben, thank you very much for taking the time with us today. Good luck with your next venture, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much, Ron. It's been a pleasure.